Hi, this is Nathan Charlton from Different Class. Today I'm talking to Jonathan White about our upcoming reading group events, and particularly about this month's event on the 26th of November. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, hi.
So our current theme for Different Class is state of emergency, and we're going to have several reading group events which tackle this topic. State of emergency, I suppose, refers to how governments behave in response to a crisis. How do you approach thinking about the powers a state claims in an emergency?
So I guess the standard formula is going to be something along the lines of exceptional times demand exceptional measures, where the exceptional times would be conventionally war, civil disorder, or possibly some kind of natural disaster, and where the exceptional measures could mean a range of things, but very often include the concentration of power in a leader or a small group, classically the dictator, as we'll come to in a moment, and where that leader or small group is authorized to act on their own judgment to do whatever is needed to ensure the survival of the polity in its crisis situation and to restore order. So it's basically a way of speeding up decision-making and making it more effective under pressing conditions. And often then that would involve potentially suspending the law or at least normal procedures, possibly also suspending the rights of citizens and of institutions like parliaments. Typically this, I guess, will be defended as a set of temporary measures. So the idea is that you shouldn't change the constitution, you shouldn't change something fundamental about the polity in the extreme moment like this. But of course, the conventional worry would be that whether these measures are actually temporary in practice is much less clear. And often you might see lasting redistributions of power ensuing. And so a major question would be, how do you constrain emergency rule? How do you, as it were, keep the dictator in his place?
So our first text is by Machiavelli, and it talks about dictators and dictatorship, as you were referring to there, and how ancient Rome responded to threats to its security. Who was Machiavelli? Why was he so interested in the Romans? And how does any of this relate to what we experience today?
So Machiavelli was a political thinker of Renaissance Florence, writing in the early 16th century. I guess when we think of him today, we often think of a very realist, almost amoral form of politics, Machiavellianism, as basically advising rulers how to do whatever is necessary to keep their grip on power. That's the Machiavelli of The Prince, one of his texts. But I think as we see in the book we're looking at for this session, the Discourses, he was also very concerned about how power is best exercised and contained, how to avoid power grabs, how to make things more orderly and less purely power political. So there's more than one Machiavelli, I guess, and yet the term Machiavellianism that we retain today perhaps only gives us half the story. I guess Machiavelli was interested in the Romans partly because all Renaissance Italian thinkers were. The Roman Republic was a kind of model for thinking about the republican city-states of Renaissance Italy. Also a way of thinking about potential weaknesses, how one could learn lessons from the decline of the Roman Republic. So it had this kind of status as a template from which one could distill lessons. And I think Machiavelli is particularly then interested in this idea of dictatorship as a way in which the Roman Republic coped with its weaknesses in extreme moments. And he thinks it's actually quite an instructive model. So the dictator, as Machiavelli reads it, was an individual put in power for a delimited period, often 6 months, often in the context of war, and basically tasked with doing whatever was necessary to ensure the Roman Republic survived. And Machiavelli, I think, finds in this something instructive, how a republic which was always potentially weak because of its divided forms of power, how it could withstand those weaknesses when push came to shove. I think he's also probably interested in it because the Roman institution of dictatorship ultimately declines. It becomes something that looks more like tyranny as you go to the period of Caesar himself. And so it has that kind of double significance. On the one hand, the institution of dictatorship is somehow the key to Roman greatness and longevity, but perhaps also it's the key to the decline of the Republic, and one can learn from it how to avoid the same fate 1500 years later. Now, moving forward again in time, I think these are actually very live issues today. We live evidently in a period of crisis, most obviously with the pandemic and COVID-19, but I think also going before that to the economic crises of the 2010s, initiated in 2008 with the financial crisis, and of course going even before that back to 2001 to 9/11 and the wave of security measures that followed in the name of fighting terrorism. So you could say, I guess, that emergency rule is somehow the quintessential model of government in the 21st century. And just looking around us today, I think you see a range of governments taking on dramatic new powers, whether it's of surveillance, whether it's of the capacity to make decisions without parliamentary scrutiny or with accelerated scrutiny. They're often doing this with public support, interestingly. And yet also, and I think as Machiavelli feared, it's often happening in quite a disorderly fashion. The response is being made in a kind of ad hoc fashion. For Machiavelli, I think the key to thinking about emergency rule is the state had to get its act together before a crisis struck, so that everyone knew how power was going to be exercised in the extreme moment. And yet what we're seeing today is almost what Machiavelli feared, a kind of disorderly improvisation in response to a crisis moment. So I think generally the old questions that Machiavelli is identifying are very much present today as much as ever. When is emergency rule justified? How should it be regulated? And ultimately, what will its legacy be?
Mm-hmm. I suppose that does make me wonder. When you talk about the contemporary responses to crisis being disorderly and ad hoc, as opposed to what Machiavelli would have advocated and preferred, to what extent that's an intentional strategy on the part of states, and how much easier it might be to do things that way. Plenty to think about anyway, and fantastic and interesting text to be helping us do that. So we'll be reading that before our reading group event on Thursday, the 26th of November. So that's different class. Takes place on Zoom. It's anyone can come along and take part, and it's free. Just go to the link that comes with this video to find out more. Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan.
See you then.
See you then.